Welcome to the Sunny Spot. I'm Kat the Humanist, filling in for Sunny today, and we are going to talk about that nuclear thing. So let's do it, Wes.
Jefferson laid great stress on it. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Welcome, Dr. Ben and Dr. Vandy. I'm so glad to see you guys today. And ironically, it's funny because the reason why Sunny is not here is because a truck hit their electricity pole, so she's unable to be here just right before the show, which of course is another type of energy different than what we're talking about. But today we're actually going to be talking about nuclear things and nuclear energy. And first I would like you guys to, if you could tell yourselves, or excuse me, not tell yourselves, but tell the audience a little bit about yourselves. And if I could start with Dr. Ben.
Okay, doke. Well, I am a nuclear physicist. That's what my PhD is in. I will quickly say that I'm not a shill for the industry because when I got out of graduate school, I could not find a job in my field. So I was a college professor for a couple of years. And then I always, when I introduce myself at cons, I always say I like scotch. And so that first gig paid $28,000 a year. And you can't buy very good scotch for $28,000 a year, particularly if you've got debt from all those years you were in grad school. So I quickly reinvented myself as a software engineer, and I did that for about 20 years. And then I did about 5 or 6 years as a controls engineer. And then finally, teaching, I think, is sort of my first best destiny. And so now that I'm semi-retired, I've gone back into teaching, and I teach engineering and physics. So I have a varied background, but I will also be quick to say that not only am I not a shill for the industry, but most of my knowledge about nuclear physics is academic. So if we start talking about really heavy duty questions about how to manage waste or something like that, I'll only be able to tell you some very general things. I don't know any specifics about that.
Well, I'm sure you know a lot more than I do. And Dr. Vandy, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am an atomic physicist. That's what my PhD is in. Atomic physics and nuclear physics are different. There's a lot of people who think that they are the same thing, probably because atomic power and nuclear power mean the same thing. I mean, people don't use say atomic power that often, but atomic bomb and nuclear bomb mean the same thing. But yeah, I'm an atomic physicist. It's really more about what the electrons are doing than it is about the stuff in the nucleus, but it's the whole package deal, sort of what I study. And I am currently a postdoc at Stanford University. And I work with ultra cold atoms and do stuff like that. And I received my PhD in 2022. So
nobody wants to receive my PhD.
Yeah, I'm much younger. I'm still in the sort of academia bubble.
My smartphone tablet, so there you go.
Well, it's kind of cool. That would be an interesting combination. I heard that most of the people that actually know how to build nuclear power plants are now dead. Do you know anything about that, Dr. Ben?
I think that's fair. I mean, we sort of gave up on the nuclear industry. I'm going to say 70s, probably early 70s. You could argue maybe mid 70s, but they're not all quite dead. There are plenty of countries. France comes to mind instantly. There are plenty of countries that have a viable and very active nuclear power program. France still gets 70-75% of their power from nuclear power. So we could import whatever expertise we needed, even if we didn't have the talent to do it ourselves here in the United States. I don't really think that's an issue, though, because we just built a plant in Georgia. They always go horribly over budget, and that's due to several reasons. but they did bring, I think, the third reactor online just maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago. So that's actually working. I mean, so the old designs, there's enough documentation, enough information, and enough engineering savvy that we can still build reactors in this country. We just proved that we could.
Yeah, I've heard it's even complex for how you do the cement, that it's just completely different from the way you do cement for other things.
Now, see, now you're saying something I'd never heard before. I didn't know that was an issue.
Yeah, so I mean, it just gets like there's more to it than people think. Although I realize that most people go, "Well, I don't know nothing about it. What the hell am I supposed to know about the cement?" Right.
And I think the other thing that's important to realize is that even though we haven't commissioned a lot of new reactors, even though we have just commissioned one, 20% of the power in this country still comes from nuclear power. So
they're very long lasting. Yeah.
And there's a very active industry where you can buy replacement parts or upgrade safety systems or do whatever you need to do. There will be some engineer, some controls engineer that knows that market and can actually do that kind of work for you. When I was at GE, I worked in the gas turbine division. I actually wrote software for GE, and we had a nuclear division, and they were putting in a bid on a nuclear plant. That was 10 years ago. So GE still putting in bids on new nuclear plants. And a lot of them, again, even though GE is an American company, a lot of them are being built, say, in India, China, and they're actively bidding for those plants in other parts of the world. So just because we're not building them here doesn't mean we don't have people that know how to build them.
So do you know anything about the safety changes they've done since, like, say, the 70s?
Oh God, it's a world of difference. Your generation 1 reactors, you really don't want to play with those if you don't have to. But your generation 2 and on are all fairly safe. As a matter of fact, one of my soapbox issues is that nuclear power is actually the safest power industry there is. It's got the best safety record of any of them. So this idea that it's antiquated and it was never fully safe and now nobody doesn't know how to do it, none of that's true. We have a better safety record in the nuclear power industry than any other.
Yes, it's dramatically so. I think that the only one that might be like vaguely similar would be something like photovoltaics or something. And even then, when you actually sit down and go and look at it, people have to work with materials in all of these industries, and there's always going to be something. Somebody has to mine the material and get the stuff. Somebody has to build the wind turbines and things, and
the death rate is never zero, right?
It's never zero. Yeah.
Like if you got a wind turbine, somebody falls off a 100-meter tall, wind turbine, that's green power, but that doesn't mean it's 100% safe.
I would be willing to bet that more people have died in the construction of nuclear power plants than have died as a result of accidents with nuclear power. I don't know that for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case.
I'm actually looking because I have one of my talks pulled up. Just so we can talk about this stuff. And there are, I think the statistics for you right there. I don't know if that's showing. There we go. So, I mean, that's our world in data. That's actually a fairly well-known website for pulling up different types of data. It's not Wikipedia or it's not some government-sponsored thing, but you see the numbers right there. You see that, safest and cleanest. So that's death rate is on the left, 0.07 deaths per terawatt hour. That's a lot, So, but of course, the units don't matter as much as how they compare to other things anyway. And so you see that, it looks like wind and solar are slightly safer. Hydropower is probably the best, but these are all nothing. I mean, if you're the one that's dying, it doesn't seem like nothing, right? But these are all nothing compared to the coal and oil industry.
Yeah, and actually that doesn't surprise me when I look at that data. That's kind of how I pictured in my head. It would be pretty similar to that.
Yeah, and the death rate for nuclear energy, it's in small text at the bottom, will be disproportionately like taken from a few like big events. And so if you're able to mitigate those risks, which we have done an amazing job at doing that, then you can basically cut it down to just the more or less totally unavoidable, very rare events that any industry is going to have.
And that's kind of a question I have too, is as far as it goes for where they're legally able to be located, because I think about earthquakes. That's the first thing that hops into my head is earthquakes and locations of nuclear power plants. Do you know anything about that, Dr. Ben?
I know that they're very sensitive to that. I know that I remember hearing a story back in the 90s about how India wanted to build a nuclear plant on a fault line at the base of the Himalayas. You got this big mountain range, probably means there's some geologic action going on there. And
yeah,
somebody spoke up and said, "Hey guys, let's think about this for a minute." And so that sort of made everybody worldwide a little bit more sensitive in terms of their planning. It's like, okay, don't build a nuclear power plant on the fault line. But I don't think it's
how long did it take them to figure that one out?
But yeah, I don't think it's a big issue. I don't think it's ever been a big issue. I think there was somebody that kind of sort of thought about doing it once, and somebody else said, no, don't do that. So they tend to be built in pretty geologically stable places. They don't even put in a proposal unless it's somewhere where it's reasonably safe in terms like that.
Was Fukushima, was that caused by, I mean, obviously tsunamis are caused by earthquakes, but was that earthquake caused or was that tsunami caused?
It was tsunami caused. Fukushima was interesting because they put all of their backup generators. One of the things about nuclear power, and you can view it as a weakness if you like, but they have to have backup generators. So if you shut the plant down, you still have to have that cooling water running through to keep the core cool, right? You don't want the thing to build up heat because the water's not flowing through it anymore. So they have to have backup generators to run the pumps, even if you shut the plant, even if you called scrambling the plant, right? You've still got to have that cooling water going through that core. And they put the backup generators basically in the basement of Fukushima. So when this tsunami came through and flooded everything in the basement, they didn't have backup generators. So the plant shut down and there was no cooling. And that's why the core partially melted down, because they lost their cooling water and they didn't have any way to get it back up and running.
Oh my God, they need somebody that has PTSD to be in charge of safety, I think.
That might help. I mean,
seriously.
It has been suggested that somebody actually said, don't put all the backup generators on the ground floor or in the basement, because this facility was 3 or 4 stories tall and they could have put a couple of generators on the roof. And, some managers said that that's not cost effective. We're just going to put it down there. And so they made a cost decision that ended up costing them a lot more than anything else would have cost them if they put a couple of generators on the roof.
It's definitely the case that you do have to, the sort of upfront in your face expenses safety wise with nuclear power, like at a plant, are pretty big, and you don't want to skimp on them at all. But they're also, the numbers don't lie. I mean, we just had the numbers there, and it's just the way other sources of power, like they it's much safer. It's much safer on the whole, and if you just have to do it right. and the consequences for not doing it right are larger, or at least more visible and more newsworthy than for other technologies.
Yeah, and Fukushima is, pretty much accepted as the second worst nuclear disaster ever. And nobody died from radiation at Fukushima. Nobody died from the nuclear power plant. Literally no one died from that. The people that died in Fukushima either died from the tsunami itself or from the evacuation efforts that the government, they weren't always real careful about moving people in the hospitals and stuff like that. So everybody that died were casualties of the tsunami. Nobody died because of the nuclear power plant. And even though they're still working to clean up that power plant even now, this is not the first time this has happened, but this is literally a case where the engineers went to bed that night thinking it was a win. Enough of the safety systems kicked in, enough things worked right, nobody died. And it was only when they woke up and read the papers the next morning that it was a disaster, a nuclear disaster.
Yeah.
Because the people that actually ran the plant thought it was a slam dunk. They thought, hey, nobody died from the plant. I mean, yeah, we've got a partial meltdown we have to deal with, but
I think it ended up being an economic disaster because of what they had. Like, there's a lot of
absolutely
leakage and irradiated water. Like, you couldn't fish in a whole chunk of area, if I remember remembering correctly.
Yeah, and some of that is, the government overreacting, declaring the whole area unlivable. It's sometimes this is an interesting discussion. And again, this would be a more interesting discussion in the case of Chernobyl.
Yeah.
And Chernobyl was a disaster, hands down, poorly managed, poorly designed plant, generation 1. So its design went back to the 60s. And
even then, so many things had to go wrong.
Yeah. And it's graphite moderated, so it's not water moderated. And it's the kind of reactor that should have never been used. You could use it for research or military stuff, but it's the kind of reactor that should have never been used for commercial power generation. And it should have never been put in a public area. But, the Soviets did anyway. But, okay, so I'm digressing. I brought that up because, this reactor caught fire. It sent radioactive smoke into the air because of the burning graphite. Every time they dumped water on it, the reactor core would put enough heat into the graphite to evaporate the water and cause the graphite to combust again. And so, it sent out all this radioactive smoke into the air, and of course all this fallout around that area. But the reason I bring all of this up and paint this picture is there were people in Chernobyl, in that area, that never moved away. There were certain farmers that were like, this is all I have. This land is all I have. It's been in my family for generations. I'm not going anywhere, regardless of the fact that the government's trying to move me, which is a hell of a thing to imagine in, Soviet Russia. But there were people that literally refused to move, and the Soviets, being the Soviets, were like, all right, stay there and die if you want to. And so that led to shop owners and priests of the local parish and all kinds of people that said, no, my people are here. They're not leaving. I'm not leaving. And so and they were all older people, old and set in their ways. We know how that works, right? As the older we get. But, they continued to live there, grow livestock, grow crops, eat them for 20 or 30 years after Chernobyl. And the cancer rate was, of course, higher, statistically speaking, but nobody just outright died from living in that area because of the radiation.
Yeah, nobody, at least the people who died of acute radiation poisoning from Chernobyl died early on. You didn't die directly from radiation poisoning after that. And
by the way, the World Health Organization death toll for Chernobyl, 26 people.
Yeah, it's
And like you say, 20 of them worked at the plant. We're trying to put the fire out. We're directly involved in trying to get that under control so more people didn't die. Good on them for that. But there's like 6 as far as statistically how many more people in that area died from cancer, than what there would have been under just a normal.
Wow.
So they make a big deal out of, what an environmental disaster this was. And it wasn't good. I'm not trying to say that it was good, but yeah, there were people that still lived in that area, did not move out in spite of what the government told them, and they lived to ripe old ages and died.
Well, now they actually have problems now with dogs. I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard about the Chernobyl dogs. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I haven't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you've got me. You've got the advantage on me too. I don't know what's happening with the dogs in Chernobyl.
Well, people left their pets, and so the dogs kept procreating and making more and more dogs.
Sure.
So they have all these dogs, and there's some type of a charity that goes in there and brings them food and stuff like that, and also gets them spayed and neutered, and they're just trying to take care of it because it had a dog population explosion.
I didn't know that. I thought you were trying to tell me that the radiation killed off the dogs or mutated.
No.
Yeah, I was like, are they mutant dogs? Do we have Cerebuses running around?
No, they're actually cute little dogs. You kind of feel sorry for them when you see them there. But if anybody wants to Google Chernobyl dogs, you'll probably be able to find a show about it. That's how I found out about it.
In Fukushima, the article I read, this was several years ago, so I don't know what state it's in now. But in Fukushima, it was the wild boars. They had these boars that lived up in the hillside, that actually had a pretty depressed population because of all the humans that lived there. And then once all the humans moved away, the boars just took over. So there's these wild boars roaming around what used to be the Fukushima area. And
oh my God! Well, that's dangerous.
Yeah, boars are dangerous.
It has led to some problems, and it is considered dangerous. But the population itself is thriving because it's not competing for space with humans anymore. So the boars are doing great. The boars live in Fukushima, and they're just having a good old time, much like the dogs in Chernobyl.
Yeah. Well, not quite. The dogs are a lot more gentle and friendly. They're actually very friendly, and they're tamed by all the workers, the charity workers that go there and take care of them. So hopefully finding homes for them.
Off the top of my head, we've already mentioned Chernobyl and Fukushima. Off the top of my head, I can only think of 3, including those 2, disasters with nuclear power. And the third would be 3 Mile Island. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I would love to talk about 3 Mile Island because that was another one of those cases where there was some pretty severe incompetence. And in spite of that, nobody died or was even seriously irradiated in 3 Mile Island. And so, again, the reason it became this thing that made the national news and that everybody was suddenly talking about was because of the way the regulators handled it. And, I'm starting to hear, and I don't really want to detract the conversation from nuclear power, but it's kind of like what I'm starting to hear about the vaccine stuff during COVID. There's a lot of smart people that think the whole COVID vaccine thing was overblown and they don't trust the government. People with scientists. I mean, we're not talking about, Bubba living on the farm that just didn't want to get a shot. We're talking about people being very critical of that. And it's that attitude of we're the government, you do what we tell you, we're looking out for you, don't ask questions. And so that was sort of the attitude at 3 Mile Island. Just evacuate, we don't care whether you think you should or not, just go. And so people bristled at that. And when they found out that they didn't really need to evacuate or have to evacuate, and it wasn't that big of a deal, that only made them angrier. So it's the mishandling of the public that really caused most of the problems at 3 Mile Island. Otherwise, it just would have been this event that we could have lived our whole life and not known anything about. It was literally a tempest in a teapot kind of situation.
Yeah. if I recall, so in 3 Mile Island, did they even have a partial meltdown, or was okay?
They did have a partial meltdown. They had a failed valve, and so it was a pressure release valve. It opened up when things got too hot, and that's perfectly fine. That's what it was designed to do, but then it didn't close back. So the steam couldn't build up enough pressure. The water didn't have enough thermal mass to it to keep the core cool, and that led to some real problems. What else can I tell you about that you might even want to know? 3 Mile Island continued to operate for decades after that incident.
I think I did know that.
They literally just decommissioned the last reactor at 3 Mile Island like last year. I mean, it wasn't that long ago.
What generation of reactors was that?
That's your light water reactor, the standard one that we pushed, atoms from peace all the way back to the 50s. So that's probably a second generation reactor.
Okay.
It's still safer than the graphite moderated military breeder reactor that the Russians were trying to use.
Yeah.
Commercial.
Now, is this not the thing that happened that the movie The China Syndrome was made after?
Oh, see, now you've just really.
I don't even know. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that at all.
No way. Okay. You guys have to check that out, because if you're interested in this stuff, I think you'd really like that movie.
Oh, no, you're not going to like me now, because that movie was utter bullshit. I've wanted to rent it and we rewatch it, and they don't make it easy for you to rent it. It's like they don't really even want you to watch it anymore. So it's hard to find and stream. Even though everybody remembers the China Syndrome. So what I remember about it, now the funny thing about the China Syndrome is it did come out about the same time 3 Mile Island came out. So it was stoking the fears of the 3 Mile Island incident, because that movie came out like a week after 3 Mile Island happened. And so it got everybody up in arms. That movie was wildly successful because of 3 Mile Island, and everybody suddenly got interested in the safety issues of nuclear power. But the movie itself was utter bullshit. And so the one thing I remember, I guess when I was a 13-year-old watching it at the movie theater, because I was interested in science even at that age, is I remember a scene where the engineers are looking at the console and they're going, all the water levels are fine. We don't understand why the reactor's getting hot. And this guy goes up and taps the glass on the meter, and the meter goes from here to here, because supposedly the needle on the meter had stuck. And it's like, that's not how that works.
No, it shouldn't be. There is tapping dials and making it move like a little bit is like a thing, but it's not just going to go whoom. and you're not gonna buy. That happens only with cheap dials. You're not going to put a cheap dial in that spot.
And you're not. And I have never seen. I can honestly tell you that, because I was a controls engineer, I have never seen an industrial control type device fail like that, where you tap it and suddenly it drops 60% of the way from where it was because you tapped it. I've never seen that happen with even a $1 million conveyor system, let alone a $1 billion reactor.
No, generally, if it moves at all, it moves like by maybe the width of the needle or something.
Right, exactly.
That's it.
Yes, that would be. They test the hell out of industrial controls, and they did even in the 70s. I mean, so, they have failure rates on relays and switches that are in the, tens of millions of operations before you can even think about them failing. So, I mean, it's like testing parts for an airplane. It's almost that stringent.
I kind of think that's what's fun about watching some of these movies, like sci-fi movies and stuff. When you're watching, you're like, that so would not work with physics. You know what I mean? I think it's fun pointing those things out. Holy shit, that is not going to happen.
And of course, the other thing is the redundancy. It's not going to be one dial at one station. If it's something that critical, like the level of the cooling water, there's going to be probably at least 3 different dials that are giving you that information. So if one's stuck, you got 2 others to tell you, no, that's not what the real value is.
And there might even be entirely independent sort of subsystems that like I don't know the details of how power plants are designed, but nowadays that wouldn't surprise me at all. But even in the graphite based research reactors that like Chernobyl, even Chernobyl, a lot of things had to go wrong for that to go wrong. It wasn't one thing. It wasn't 2 things. It was several pretty big things. And
it was a cascade of events.
Yes. But cascade, it was a cascade in the sense that because cascade can also, to me, indicate or suggest that after the first thing goes bad, everything else is inevitable, and that was also not the case. Incompetence was part of the reason that it kept on getting worse, but also from a sort of malfunctioning point of view, you have to have more than one thing independently kind of go wrong.
And the main catalyst for the whole disaster, right?
It wasn't like the top of the rods or something, not like submerged.
Oh, that's bad design. That's
okay.
That's not where I was going with that. Where I was going with that is they decided to shut off the cooling water I think it's cooling water. Yeah, something like that at 2 a.m. with a green crew.
Oh, yeah.
Someone had decided that we're going to do this safety test on this reactor, and we're just going to shut off the cooling water and see if the safety system kicks in. Well, lo and behold, the safety system didn't kick in like it was supposed to, and the crew didn't know what to do about it.
And that was an institutional failing. Like that test should not have been done under those circumstances by those people at that time.
That was a monstrous institutional failure. It's like one of the worst things I've ever heard.
Yes. It reminds me a little bit. I mean, I don't know. It reminds me a little bit of the Challenger disaster. How there's enough incompetence that sort of stacks up that it's the reason Challenger blew up was because of a bad O-ring, I think, sort of fundamentally physically, but right. The reason really was because the institution failed to actually properly communicate and understand what the risks were, moving up from the people who knew about it. At each step, you sort of get a little bit of language that's like, okay, this is probably fine, and it becomes a little bit political. And these things can't be political. They can't be.
You can't let the administrators and the management make some of these decisions. There literally was a quote from the Challenger disaster where there was an engineer or a scientist, I think it was actually an engineer, in the meeting going, this is not a good idea. There's safety issues here. And one of the administrators telling him that he needed to take off his engineering hat, put on his management hat, and, consider all the other factors that go into launching that rocket on time. And it's like, that was a lesson for me.
Yeah. Huh? That's the veto factor. This is a bad idea. It's gonna blow up. The engineers need to have the veto power to be able to do that. And
when I read that, in 1988, when I was a senior in physics major undergrad. It's like that. That's a lesson I took to heart. It's like, no, you can't. There are certain situations. It doesn't matter what your boss is telling you. You just have to say, no, we're not doing it. You can fire me if you want, but we're not doing it. Because it literally, I actually teach this in our engineering ethics course. You're literally going to get somebody killed if you go along with it. And you can lose a job, but you don't want killing a bunch of people on your conscience. I mean, it's just that simple.
Yeah.
Or it should be that simple. Lots of times it's not, but it should be that simple. There's certain responsibilities that you take on when you decide you're going to be an engineer. And I'm going to say an engineer and not a scientist in this case, but there are certain responsibilities that you have to take on, leadership responsibilities as an engineer, even as a low-level engineer. I mean, there are plants that literally had this philosophy that even the lowest level worker could shut down a line if he saw something that didn't look right. And I think that's the right attitude to have when you're playing around with sources of energy, right? Like whether it's a 500 horsepower motor driving a big conveyor, or whether it's a nuclear power station.
And one of the things I've just noticed, Dr. Ben, when I've just run into emergency situations that I've seen, that I've been in, there gets to be like this bystander effect, where if you don't do it, nobody's going to do it.
Right.
And I've seen it way too many times. And it's really sad. You can't really get upset with the people. It's just something that's built into people where they just freeze and watch. You know what I mean?
I think it's becoming a bigger problem over time too, because the world of people that go to school, they want the name engineer. They want that title, and they want the high paying job. But even when they're in class doing their thing, they're just trying to do the assignment, get the right answer, and move on without really understanding what's going on. In GE, we called it checking the box. Management told us to do this thing. Let's just check the box and move on to the things that we want to be doing. And there's a whole lot of that that's happening everywhere now. And that's a real problem. Ironically, I think that's probably less of a problem for a nuclear engineer in a plant than it would be for a lot of other places. I think those guys are still trained to take their job very seriously, and I think most of the parts and materials that they use in nuclear plants have been tested for 30, 40 years now. And they have backup of backup systems, kind of thing. They've got triple redundancy on everything. So, it's probably less of a problem there, but it's like these Boeing aircraft. Suddenly.
I was about to bring up, I think the industry where we're really seeing that kind of laxness really start to cause big problems is Boeing, specifically Boeing.
And
Boeing used to be a model of a great company that was it was a company that was run and really driven by the engineering for a long time and had such a great reputation. And that reputation over the last decade and a half or so, probably longer than that, but really it doesn't have that reputation anymore. Because
and it doesn't help to make my point about the nuclear industry either. Because
no, it doesn't.
There was a time when aviation, again, those people were super serious, tested everything to the nth degree, and the FAA made them. So I'm not exactly sure how they could get away with that. It's
they got put in charge of. They were in charge of inspecting themselves.
Yeah, that's crazy. Don't do that. My dad was a pilot. He flew the little planes like the Cessnas and the Beechcraft Barons and things like that. And I remember again giving the mechanic a hard time because he had a light go out. So he took it over to the hangar where the mechanic hung out. Said, "You got to replace this light." The guy charged him. We're not talking about labor, right? That's a whole nother discussion. The guy charged him $15 for the light bulb. And I'm like, "Joe, are you insane? I could go to Radio Shack and buy the same light bulb with the same characteristics for 50 cents. How do you get off charging $15 for a light bulb?" This would have been like, 1987, right, when we were having this discussion. And his response was, it's the testing. These things are rated, they're tested, hundreds of times over, and they have very exacting manufacturing standards. Now, some of that's bullshit, right? I mean, a light bulb's a light bulb, but he's right. As somebody that's now actually worked in the engineering field and knowing what kind of testing, when you build a conveyor system, how many hours you spend just making sure the thing does what it's supposed to do before you ship it. There's a lot of hours in that. So that definitely adds to the cost. It's why, you get $1 million for a simple conveyor system that if you just looked at it, you go, well, that's $10,000, $30,000 worth of parts, and you're charging $1 million for it. And it's like, yeah, but there's hundreds of engineering hours behind it. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the design of the thing, because that happens even when you take an old design and you make another one, just like one that you made 10 years before. It still costs, in that case, it's still going to cost $500,000. So it's still, 2 orders of magnitude up from the cost of the parts, just because of the testing you do and making sure the thing works before you send it out. So there's a lot of that built in, and rightfully so. And the fact that now that seems to be failing in certain cases where that should have never failed is problematic. And so if you want to talk about nuclear power, if you want to bring it back to that, you could make the argument that maybe humans just shouldn't be allowed to do certain things. But we've been flying aircraft for, ever since World War II, commercially. So it's the cost of progress.
You can do things with nuclear power and nuclear reactors that you can't do with any other power source. If you need a power source that you're not going to be, that you have to lock in like a metal tube, and then you're never going to be able to go into that metal tube and fix it or do anything with it or add fuel to it, then really your only option, if sunlight isn't available, is going to be nuclear. Mm-hmm. Because submarines, a lot of submarines are nuclear. And one of the reasons I imagine is because they can just kind of, the time is not an issue for them. Also, I think they're probably more efficient and stuff like that, and like smaller. But
yeah, I don't know about that. When you're talking about power plants in a submarine,
but I'm also thinking like satellites too.
yeah, or nuclear batteries and satellites. Yeah,
but that's not nuclear power in the same in the way of that. Really, what that is that's a heat source. I think that lasts a really, really, really long time, and then you're able to use the heat differential to like drive a Peltier circuit. Is that your understanding of how nuclear batteries in like satellites work?
Well, they didn't have, when they launched Voyager, I don't think they had Peltiers.
So I don't know what that. Yeah, well, Voyager, I think
they actually used good old thermocouples, and it actually generated enough voltage to stick in a thermocouple in this hot pile that it was able to power the electronics.
Could you guys explain to the audience what Peltiers are? Because I'm sure there's probably quite a few people in there that have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm gonna let you do this one because
so a Peltier heater or cooler is basically it's a thing that has that has 2 sides, and then you can run current through this like 2-dimensional sort of thing, and when you run current through it, it basically moves heat due to some black magic that I'm not actually intimately familiar with, from one side to the other, and it also goes the other way. If you have a heating differential, it will produce a current that goes. But I don't.
I haven't picked on you much tonight, and we're almost. I feel I need to pick on you over this Peltier thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. Because it's atomic physics, right? You've got all these electrons that are vibrating and they're getting transported via electricity to the cold side of the thing, or from the cold side to the warm side. It's a heat pump, but it's a heat pump at the atomic level, which you ought to be eating that up with a spoon, man.
Well, I said that's basically what I said. You haven't added anything.
Okay, all right. You said it in a way that wasn't as clear to me.
Okay, that's fair.
It's
got a hot side and a cold side.
I had to pick on you a little bit.
But you're right. You're right. That's a more concise way of putting it. It is a heat pump, and it's reversible. It also is an It's also a generator. You can also generate electricity through by having a heat differential or a temperature differential.
Right, which is important for our discussion about satellites and power systems and satellites. But that's uber cool that you can actually take a heat differential and get electricity out of it, which you can also do with the Peltier device.
It's the fundamental. You in order to get energy out, or usable energy or work done out of a heat engine, you need a heat differential. It's the kind of ultimate. It's the ultimate price, although you might also think entropy is the ultimate price. Really, they're very intimately related concepts, because
people do kind of know what they are.
Yeah.
Because I remember when we used one to cool a chip in a job I had back in, I'm going to say 01, maybe 2000. They were new then, but very quickly they started making these coolers that you could plug into your cigarette lighter in your car. And clearly we weren't talking about a compressor and a motor. This thing ran quietly, but it kept your soft drinks cold. Maybe only one or two of cans, but you could plug it in, and it was a couple $100 back then. And I'm sure if we go to Amazon, we could still find them. But yeah, so that became a thing that became commercially available, and everybody's at least seen something like that, over the last 25 years. So, it is technology that you're aware of. You just don't know that it's called the Peltier device.
Yeah.
I had a slide up a minute ago before we got off on the tangent about the Peltier. I almost kind of sort of forgot what my point was, but I'm going to make it anyway. We were talking about, we're talking about risk. We're talking about people not always paying attention and that leading to disaster. But when you have those kinds of conversations, you also have to look at the flip side of it, right? So I have this slide. It's not very pretty. It's just text. I actually had it at the end of a lecture I gave. But the thing you have to understand is there are 1.2 billion people on the planet right now that don't have electricity, and they want it. And we want them to have it because they're mostly burning dung to stay warm. So imagine the kind of health effects that you deal with when you're burning dung in your fireplace in your house to stay warm. Nuclear power has averted 1.84 million deaths, because of the health effects from burning coal and things like that. So statistically speaking, nuclear power has averted 1.84 million deaths, 370 times more lives saved than lost in the last 40 years. So yes, this is how progress works, right? You get more power, you can do more damage, whether it's a 747 crashing into the ground or whether it's a power plant. So yeah, the cost or the risk might be higher, but the benefits still outweigh the risk by any kind of math you want to do. And so yes. I don't mind discussing the fact that maybe people aren't as careful, as they once were, but you've also got to weigh the risk versus the reward. So I wanted to get that in there as a point as well. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that nuclear power is dramatically underused. It's technically not renewable in the same way, but you're not going to run out of nuclear fuel.
Right.
you might have problems getting it because sometimes there are certain types of reactors that are different reactors use different fuel, and different fuels are going to be available in different locations. Like if you need to use plutonium, then you can't mine plutonium anywhere. Actually, you have to make it.
Right. It's not naturally occurring.
And
uranium is naturally occurring, plutonium isn't.
Yes, uranium is naturally occurring, thorium is naturally occurring. But like here in the United States, we have access to probably some of those resources much more than we have to others. And if you are going to bring up if politics is going to come into this, then self-sufficiency is something that we can be a lot more self-sufficient with nuclear power than, at least for a long time, we were with oil, and probably still with oil.
Well, and so, maybe we go back to talk about green energy and solar and wind.
Yeah.
Some of those things are just flat out not ready for prime time right now. Now, that's not to say I'm anti-solar or anti-wind, or anti-tidal. I think all of those technologies should continue to be explored and developed.
Mm-hmm.
But when I gave this talk a couple of years ago for one of the cons I was at, I actually came across this article that I have on slide right now. And basically, this article is saying that the energy in nuclear waste could power the U.S. for 100 years. So we're not talking about digging fresh ore out of the ground. We're talking about the waste that's sitting in the back of these nuclear power plants. They can be repurposed. They can be refined again to have the percentages of U-235 that they have to have. They can be run through breeder reactors, which this is not what this article is driving at, because you could have nuclear power virtually forever, through a properly made breeder reactor.
Yeah.
But that's not what
reactor
suggesting. This is suggesting that the stuff that we've already mined out of the ground, run through a core once, and is sitting out the back of nuclear power plants could be recycled, if you will, and that's almost in the right use of the word right. And that could provide us power for 100 years. 100 years from now, wind and solar are going to be much better than what they are today. And so they may actually be a solution 100 years from now. But if you want to stop greenhouse gases going into the air now, this is how you do it.
Yes.
This is the only way you do it.
Yes. The other thing, wind and solar are always going to rely on some type of storage of that electricity, either directly with batteries or by pumping a bunch of water up a hill and then letting it come back down. And you're going to lose efficiency there. It's not on demand. Nuclear, the large power plants, they do have some inertia. They can't just double their output in 20 seconds. But generally, the amount of power being drawn by the grid also doesn't double in 20 seconds either. It can be adjusted to suit the demands of the grid, which you can't really do with solar or wind without having a sort of middleman.
Yep. So I have another slide I pulled up just to make your point. This almost feels unfair, right? Because I've given this talk before, so I have all of these things preloaded that I can just throw at you. So this is the case. This is called the Duff graph, right? And you can bet that this is for California in particular, which tends to have a very mild climate, but lots of sunshine. And so what this graph is showing you, let's see, will my mouse pointer show up on this? I don't think so. But what this graph is showing you is that when solar and wind power are at a maximum, the demand for the power is at a minimum, because it's usually at, what's it say there, 11 to 4 o'clock in the 11 in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So when the demand is lowest, that's when you're making the most solar power. That sounds like that could be manageable, but batteries are not environmentally friendly. And I don't even want to think about making the kind of batteries you'd have to make to store this kind of power, even temporarily. The other problem with the duct graph, which is why it gets brought up in so many of these kinds of discussions, is that you need at least a day, probably more like 2, to spin up a nuclear power plant. Now, once it's running, it'll run 24/7 for 30 years, you know. But if you actually take a nuclear power plant offline and shut down its energy generation, it's going to take you a couple of days to get it back up. Now, and so that's nuclear. That's one thing. But that's true even with a standard combined cycle gas generator plant. It takes about 4 to 6 hours to ramp them back up. So if you turn off all of these old fossil fuel plants because you go, oh, I've got plenty of solar, then when it gets dark and suddenly you don't have solar power anymore, you don't have electricity because the power generation is not there. You've turned off all the plants that continue to provide that power, and they're not coming back for a while. So, you know, storing it in a battery and giving it to folks at night after the power has been generated sounds great, but that is an environmental catastrophe. It's rare earth metals that are dug out of the ground, and they're called rare earth metals for a reason. Sorry. You dig up a lot of soil and you filter out a lot of crap just to get a little bit of some of these rare earth metals. They are not they always involve strip mining, huge mines, huge plots of land. They are not environmentally friendly by any standard. So you want to start talking about wind generation and solar, that's great, but you also have to talk about being able to store it, and the storage is not environmentally friendly, even if you find a way to make the solar cells, which they're not really environmentally friendly either. Processes that go into making them.
Giant flywheels are better than batteries.
Yeah, flywheels are good. Gravitational storage is good. You know, if you can do that kind of thing, that makes it much more manageable. But they've had limited success even with that, I think.
Yeah.
So far. And again,
so far,
you know, 100 years from now, you know, maybe we've got all this stuff nailed, but we need to buy time. And the only way you're going to buy time and reduce greenhouse emissions is the nuclear power. I think it's really that simple.
I know we're like running over a tiny bit, so you can say no, but I was hoping you would get to thorium reactors, and maybe if you could just give a little bit of explanation to people about that, because I think there might be a lot of people that don't know about it and don't know the difference between that and the other nuclear power.
Well, we always run over. We did last time we did this. A good half hour, as I recall. So, I mean, unfortunately, that's going to happen. I've actually got a diagram somewhere. I don't want to spend a lot of time looking for it, but it might be fun to just throw something up there real fast. Here's your molten salt reactor. That's your thorium right there. You take what's effectively a salt. So it's thorium plus something that gives it a certain chemical property to make it like salt. And it has a high melting point. And so this stuff melts inside this reactor. The salt itself is what's radioactive, so it goes through a heat exchanger and it produces heat. And so there is chemical processing that has to go on that removes the waste products and then puts the thorium, the active thorium, back in there. So it's not trivial. But one of the things that makes thorium attractive to a lot of people is this freeze plug at the bottom. And the concept goes like this. If this reactor were to ever start overheating, that freeze plug which is made out of the same salt material as the rest of that stuff, but it's cooled by a refrigerator coil wrapped around it. So if things overheat, if there's a power outage, so things aren't being circulated, the refrigeration stops on the freeze plug. That plug melts, and it acts like a valve that opens up all of that molten thorium and dumps it into a big tray underneath the plant, which is subcritical. So it can't overheat and it can't melt down in the sense that it's going to burn through the basement of the plant and go into the soil, the same way that a uranium plant could melt down in principle. The other concept that I'm more fond of, and I can explain to you a little bit why, is the pebble bed reactor. Because when we started talking about 4th and 5th generation reactors, my first exposure was pebble bed reactor. Pebble bed's simple. You basically take a billiard ball full of uranium, and it's air cooled. And so you have a whole bunch of these billiard balls full of uranium, but the ceramic that encases these things keep the material far enough apart that they can't ever go supercritical on you. And on top of that, even if you cut off the airflow, the little ceramic billiard balls can never get hot enough to melt. So these are two examples of walk-away reactors. They literally demo these reactors by randomly turning the dials on the control panel and walking away from them and demonstrating that nothing bad happens even when they do that, other than it's not generating power as efficiently as it could, right, if it were being properly managed. So these, I mean, the claim, and I'm sure some people are going to have raised eyebrows when I say this, but the claim is these can't melt down. These are the kind of plants that can't melt down.
So what's the temperature inside that pebble bed, the ball? How high does that get?
See, you actually just led me into the thing I wanted to talk about, assuming I can find the slide I'm looking for right here. So when you talk about molten salt, you're talking about 1,000 degrees Celsius, or an operating temperature of about 700 degrees Celsius, it says here, approximately. Multiply that times 9/5, what do we get? 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. It's pretty warm.
Oh.
Okay. Your temperature range of your gas coolant is 6,000 degrees Celsius, and it tends to operate at about 1,000 degrees Celsius. Now, the thing about this is, so we're talking about 2 or 3 times hotter than a standard light water reactor. But when I worked at GE, you know, we had these turbine designs. We had these gas turbine designs that they had basically been in place for 30 or 40 years, in some cases since the 50s. And the whole trick, the whole reason that they had all these engineers, there were 20,000 people on this gas turbine campus. And the whole thing they were doing is trying to squeeze another 0.1, 0.2% out of these turbines that we were selling for like $100 million to customers. And 0.1%, the way they explained it to me is a 0.1% increase in efficiency is worth $40,000 a year to the manufacturer. And so if you're running these gas turbines for 30 or 40 years and you've made them 0.1% more efficient, that's real money to the guy that's running the plant. So much so that you can actually increase the value of the turbine, what you charge for it, because it has a slightly higher efficiency rating. And so how do you do that? This is simple thermodynamics. You can always make a more efficient engine if your hot side of your engine is hotter than what it would be if it was cooler. It's just simply easier to pull the energy out of a system that's super hot like that. So even when we were designing gas turbines, it was all about being able to burn the fuel hotter than what we did the year before. And so we were doing all kinds of crazy things like running air cooling through the vanes of the gas turbines. and stuff like that, because literally if they weren't air cooled, the blades would melt from the heat, kind of thing. And so we were doing all kinds of tricks like that. And it's the same here. You're going to make a more efficient plant the hotter you run the plant. And so, yes, these things run at higher temperatures, but they're still safe at those higher temperatures. The other thing that I saw the slide, let me see if I can find it again. The other thing about doing that is you can take the waste heat and you can do things like smelt aluminum or make fertilizer, some aspects of steel production, it says here. All of these processes right now, they're at a plant down the road from the power plant. They take the electricity and they convert it back into heat. But this actually would lead you, having a pebble bed reactor that runs at that really high temperature, leads you into a different kind of industry where you're taking the waste heat from that reactor and you're actually doing other industrial processes with it. Making concrete is actually heat intensive. And these are all things that you do just by taking the exhaust from this nuclear power plant, and instead of turning it into electricity and then turning it back into heat in a furnace.
Well, even making ceramics too. I mean, I can think of a lot of things we could do with that.
There are a lot of processes that people would get excited about if you said, "Hey, I've got this 1,000-degree hot gas coming off of this plant." Now, will it actually go this way? Will it actually work this way? I don't know, because we had combined cycle plants at GE. Because part of what you could do to increase that efficiency is you could take the waste heat from those turbines. So you had the turbines burning fuel and they were driving a generator directly. But then you could take the exhaust from those turbines and you could pump it into a boiler and you could boil water and you could run another steam generator on top of the direct drive generator that's connected to the turbine. That's called a combined cycle plant. So I don't know that anybody's even considered taking that waste heat from a pebble bed reactor and turning it into a combined cycle plant. But if they ever start building them, somebody's going to do it. So,
and I kind of want to clarify my ceramics point, because that might be freaking people out when we talked about being covered with ceramics. Is that I'm talking about very low fire ceramics. I am not talking about high fire ceramics. It would not work for high fire ceramics.
Right. All of this is stuff that requires a lot of heat, but not the most heat. Like, they're not talking about smelting iron here, right? That takes a whole lot more heat. I did a project when I was a controls engineer for a glass tempering plant. I would think that this kind of thing could lend itself to tempering glass, which is not even one of the examples listed here, right? But
yeah, you wouldn't be able to do glass blowing, though. I think you need 1,270 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yep.
To do glass blowing.
Yeah, turning it molten is different than tempering it, just on the outside.
Yeah. That would just be a wishful that you could glass blow with it, but
I actually had a project when I was an engineer that tempered glass, and they had these conveyor systems. And basically the panes of glass, after they were cut and, after they'd cooled down and were cut to the right sizes, they ran through these conveyors that went through this oven that looked like a tanker car, from a railroad track. And up inside that tanker car was a bunch of coils, like the coils you see inside a toaster, right? And they glowed red hot when power was being applied to it. It was an insane amount of power. And so they paid my firm at the time something like $250,000 for me to write a program just to get those panes of glass on the conveyor as close to one another as they could without breaking them. Because even if they turned that oven off for a couple of seconds, because the panes of glass were closer together, they were willing to pay $250,000 because they were going to make it back in the cost of electricity.
Yeah, it takes a lot of energy to work with glass. Definitely.
And so to do it with electricity can be very costly. Even a 10 cents a kilowatt hour, it can be very costly.
So did you guys have any last thoughts that you wanted to add to the show?
I'm going to go back to some slides.
I'm for it.
You want me to go or you want to go, Vandy?
You can go.
Okay. So I'm going to go back into presentation mode. There we go. This is your typical chemical process of burning fossil fuel. And the only takeaway here is that the power, this is atomic physics, right? You're moving electron orbits around. It's a chemical process, really, but
yeah, it's, but yes,
it's 50. These reactions, oxidation of fossil fuels tend to run about 50 megajoules per kilogram. You don't have to know what a megajoule is. You don't even have to know what a kilogram is. I just want you to see the units so that when you see these units, you know that it's not an apples to orange comparison.
yeah, it's not comparable.
So this is a reaction inside a nuclear reactor where you're fissioning U-235, and it makes 800,000 or 800 million megajoules per kilogram. So this is literally 6 orders of magnitude up in power generation from what you can do with a chemical process. I always say when I get to this point that if I'm walking around town with $1 in my pocket, I can't even buy a cup of coffee. If I'm walking around with $1 million in my pocket, I can get whatever the hell I want.
Yep.
You know, including a Maserati dealership down the street. So this is the kind of power generation that we're talking about. We did not get to the waste thing. People get really bent out of shape about the waste, but all of the nuclear waste in this country, the statistic is that it could fit in a football field of, think 30 feet high, 3 stories high, something like that. There are ash ponds from coal burning plants that are bigger than that. They've actually had the dams break on an ash pond in a coal burning plant and flood a town before. So when you generate 1 million times the power, you also tend to make a million less times the waste from that power. So yes, nuclear waste is dangerous. It has to be handled carefully, but there is a hell of a lot less of it than what you have to do in any other industry. I don't care if you dump it in a bunker out in the desert and pour concrete all over it. It's still way more manageable than the waste we're managing every day in fossil burning plants. You know, so that's an important point. One of the things that I love to talk about that we didn't get to is your personal tax on the power that you consume as far as the waste goes. You tend to burn about 3 M&Ms worth of nuclear fuel per year as a consumer. If you go over a 100-year lifespan, it's about a Coke can worth of nuclear fuel, nuclear waste that you generate if you're consuming power through a nuclear power plant. It is literally endless tons of waste. Any other industry, so if I were responsible for having to get rid of a Coke can worth of nuclear waste when I died, I'd say bury it in my coffin with me, right? I mean, it's literally that ridiculous. Yes, that's a tax I can pay. But anything else, whether you're talking about hydroelectric or wind or whatever, disposing of all of that fiberglass from those blades for those wind turbines it's monstrously huge. It's thousands of pounds worth of waste for every human that consumes electricity at the level that we do. So, yeah, I think that's it. I think I can stop there. It's just this whole industry's been unfairly maligned, and the things they worry about are literally tempest in a teapot. I mean, compared to the waste that you have to deal with in any other industry, it's nothing. And again, I'm not trying to make light of it and say you shouldn't handle it carefully. I don't want anybody to get that idea. But it's practically nothing compared to all the fossil fuels we burn and all the carbon that we dump into the air.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll stop now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the problems that we have with nuclear power, the biggest problem that we have with nuclear power is that we don't have enough of it. And the problems in getting it to work and stuff like that tend to be political and institutional. They're not physical. They're even the engineering challenges, the way they go wrong is when the institution fails. The engineering can be done. We can do this. We have done it. It's being done by a lot of people all over the world. People are used to the background din of the harms that all of that is happening from coal and from oil and from natural gas. It's so much, and yet we're just fine with it.
Yep.
It seems. I mean, we're not fine with it, but people tend to be fine with it. I think that one of the biggest issue, like the biggest issue that we have with nuclear waste in this country is a not in my backyard problem. If I were a billionaire, I would probably buy a chunk of land somewhere that nobody had any real interest in, and I would just build a giant hole in the ground, and then I'd be like, yo, I'll put it in my backyard. Because I don't know that I would actually want everybody to be buried with their own nuclear waste, because you don't want people to just go to your local graveyard and like dig up nuclear waste and then like
Well,
throw it
actually,
I see your point.
the joke I made last time when we were discussing this is 3 M&Ms per year. I don't care if you shove it up my ass. Right? And if a terrorist wants to come and get depleted uranium out of my asshole after I'm dead, I can live with that, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, the other thing about that, if you're going to bring in the terrorism aspect, let's bring in another aspect too. That's the same thing, but differently stated. Most of that nuclear waste can be, and we covered this earlier, actually. Now that I remember showing you that article, that 100 years thing, right? That nuclear waste is not actually waste in the sense that it's spent and it's not good anymore. That waste can be repurposed and put back into reactors.
Yeah.
So it's still valuable. I think, you hear these stories about these plant managers that, they were kind of glad that Yucca Mountain failed because the environmentalists, made sure that got killed. And they're still temporarily storing all this used nuclear waste in the backside of the plant. But I kind of think that there's a whole lot of plant managers that realize that stuff's going to be valuable someday. When we stop getting so namby-pamby about this stuff and we start recycling it. And again, we kind of already do process. So that's dirty, that's dangerous, yada, yada, yada. We kind of do that sort of thing even now. Savannah River takes old nuclear weapons, mostly from the Ukraine, and they repurpose it as nuclear fuel. So they're taking literally the plutonium out of these old nuclear weapons and just going with the uranium that's in there and turning them into fuel pellets. So people, again, there are industries that deal with this stuff every day, and you never hear about anybody dying at any of these plants because the safety measures are so stringent.
I wonder how many nuclear scientists have ever discussed this with like our legislature.
I think part of the problem is that nobody has a vested interest. These discussions were probably had back in the 60s and 70s, and people knew it. But if you're a politician and you got 100,000 people screaming at you about building this nuclear plant, and you've got nobody going, I think it's great that you're building a nuclear plant, keep up the good work, then the politician is going to go err on the side of making the screaming people happy. And there's nobody that's as boisterous for the other side as the environmentalist hippie types that think they're doing the world a service by killing the nuclear power industry. They've actually done more to kill this planet than just about anybody else when you look at it in those terms.
I wonder sometimes if it's just not brought up to them correctly. You know what I mean? Like a comparison, especially in the situation we're in now.
I think that that a lot of people also, their reaction is it's difficult for them to separate nuclear power from nuclear weapons technology. I don't know that for sure, but I do know it for sure. People have a hard time separating those two, and we have spoken now. We've been talking for an hour and a half. How many times did I mentioned it a little bit, and atomic is a thing that we haven't talked about weapons.
Nor should we. I mean, being upset with the nuclear industry because somebody made a bomb out of it is like being upset with chemistry because somebody figured out how to make explosives.
Yeah.
It's way more useful in way more areas than just making bombs to kill each other with.
Yes.
Here's a slide for you. If you want to throw that up real fast. And it's funny the way you said that, because even when I gave this talk, I said it the same way. It's like, I don't know that they're doing it on purpose. And then I pulled up this slide and I said, take that back. I do know they're doing it on purpose. The environmentalists there's a lot of environmentalists, and maybe not just environmentalists, but that's who we're talking about right now, that think they can play by whatever rules they want as long as they get the results they want, and they're not worried about what's fair or right. And so,
or true.
And they deliberately conflated the whole nuclear weapon thing with nuclear power thing, and they did it on purpose because they knew it would scare the shit out of people. But again, it's like saying, I'm not going to buy this plastic part for my car because I'm afraid of dynamite. One's not the other, right? You don't have to buy a stick of dynamite to put a piece of plastic in your car. So it's the difference between chemistry and nuclear power. It's like, I think I've made that point. I think I've made myself clear on that one.
Yeah, I think we just need more education on it, honestly. And when they think about it, how are you going to get rid of, the CO2 in the air and things like that if we don't get rid of some of the oil and gas industry issues that we're having? What's going to do that?
It's the only way.
Yeah.
And that's in their term.
Last forever. Yes. Yeah.
You got the fusion thing, you got wind, solar, tidal, all of that stuff's good. And again, maybe we'll have all that sussed out in 100 years. But if you want to fix it now, I mean, it's the only way to fix it now.
I agree. Al, you're depressing me when you say things like that. Just saying it. I'll just show you what he put up there. It's like, no, don't say that.
That's a whole nother discussion. We should maybe have a talk about that one night.
Oh, yeah, Lord. Yeah, that is. It's a rough business right now, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank both of you guys for coming on and talking about this, because I think it's a really important topic. And thank you for putting up with me also. I'm sure I surprised you when you saw it was me tonight. And I also want to thank the patrons, Eric Ozols, Rion, Deneen Murphy, Dan D, Michael Wiseman, Cindy Plaza, Sunny Shell, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, Amanda McLeod, and Logan Fisher. And also don't forget to check out our other shows on Skeptic Haven. Tuesdays, Secular Soapbox. Thursdays, The Sunny Spot. Saturday, The Global Atheists and Women Atheists on Load. And Let's Talk on Sunday. And this Saturday on Women's Atheists on Load, we have Intersection of Sexism, Feminism, and Religion. I think it's going to be a lively conversation that you guys won't want to miss. And remember, the show is not just for women. It is by women for everyone. And I want to thank you again for coming on. And hopefully you guys will see Sunny next week. And thank you, everybody that's been hanging out with us in the chat tonight. Bye, everybody.
It's been fun.
Our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan